Are you using Angular services correctly in your Angular applications, or are you just using provided in every single place in your apps? In this video, we are going to discuss about when to use provided in Angular services, when to not use it, and how to lazily load an Angular service within your application. With that said, let's have a look at the application right now. We have an app where you can log in as an admin or employee, and this is a fake login, but still when you log in, you are presented on this page. Now in here, you can choose a particular fruit and add it to your bucket. So I can add, let's say 3 apples like this. And as a result, you will see the items right here, and you will also see some logs as well. So we have two components. We have a bucket component, including this select and the list. And we then have this logs component, which logs the activities of admin in this case. But this also logs the activity of employee as well. So if I go to employee, I can also add some items from here. Let's say I add an apple from here. You can see that anything that is added by an employee is shown as with this red border, and anything that is of an admin is by a green border on the left. Now we have a problem in this situation, and that is an admin can see all the logs, including the admin logs and the employee logs, but the employee can also see all the logs, which is of the admin as well. This is not what we want, and usually that's not the case in the application. We do have some restrictions also on the employee level, which means that an employee can only add 5 items, and then they will be given this alert that you can only add 5 items, and an employee cannot delete any of the items from an admin as well, whereas an admin can essentially delete all the items. So apart from the tutorial you're watching, just studying the application itself will also teach you a lot of things, and you can find the link of the code in the description. And we are also going to start from a branch named start. So let's have a look at that. But before that, if you don't know who I am, I'm Mohammad Ahsan. I'm a Google developers expert in Angular for the past 7 to 8 years. And I've created tons of libraries and projects that hundreds and thousands of developers use. And I'm also an author of 2 books, including this one, which is the Angular Cookbook, which is always up to date with the latest Angular version and contains so many things that you can learn from to make your Angular skills top notch. To have a look at this and also ask an AI about any topic in Angular and a reference from the book, check out ngcookbook.com and talk to the AI. With that said, let's get back to our first problem. We want separate logs for admin and employee. Now in a real world application, you may want the admin to be able to see the employee logs as well, but we are not going to do that here. We're going to just isolate so that an admin can see their own logs and an employee can see their own logs. And before even implementing anything, I want to show you the architecture of this application. So we have the app component at the top, then we have an admin page and an employee page, as you saw, and both of those pages use 2 components, a bucket component and a logs component. The logs component only depends on the log service, and this is provided in root. If we have a look at the log service, you will see that this contains a really simple property named logs, which is an array of logs, and it contains a method which is called log. So whenever this method is called, the message is added to this array. And then we have a method to get this logs. And if you look at the logs component, you are going to find that all it does is just injects the log service and uses the getLogs method to get an array, and then it essentially just renders that using the for loop in Angular. So we're just logging logs from the log service. That was a mouthful. Now let's talk about the bucket component. The bucket component uses the bucket service to basically add items to the bucket or remove items from the bucket and whatnot. But the bucket service also uses log service to log if anything changes to the bucket. For example, when you add an item or remove an item, it uses the log service to add the logs. And when we actually go to the bucket.service.ts, here we can see that this is provided in root. This uses a signal array for bucket. And here you can see that we are using the log service. So whenever there's an add item call from the UI, it finally ends up in logging that information using the log service. Similarly, it also does it like this. Now, one important thing to understand is that log service and bucket service, since they both are provided in root, whenever we do that, Angular registers this service as a single instance or a singleton in the whole application, which means that all the components in the Angular application are using just one instance of log service and one instance of bucket service. That's exactly why the admin component and the employee component both can see the same exact bucket. And that's also the reason why we have this problem of the logs being the same in both of those components. So they're using the same array. So what we want to do in this case is, rather than having the log service here in the root, we want it to be here on the component level. So we are going to provide our log service to admin component, and we are also going to provide a log service to employee component. What this does in theory is that this will create a different instance of log service for admin and a different one for employee component, which means that the array for both of them would be different, which means that they would not be able to see each other's logs. Really nice. But there's one catch. When we provide a service on a component level, the service dies when the component is destroyed. So if I navigate away from admin to employee and employee to admin, the logs would no longer exist. We could use something like an API call to save this to the backend, or we can use local storage to save them. But to keep this example simple, I'm not going to do that. But I think I want you to try it out to save the logs for employee and admin separately in the local storage, and that would be a really interesting exercise for you to do. Now, having said that, let's try it out. We're going to go to the log service and we are going to remove this provided in root. So I'm just gonna remove this and save this and let's see what happens. So if I go to my application, you can see nothing is being shown, which means that something is breaking. So the first thing I'm gonna do is go to console and see what's happening. Here you can see that this shows an error which says admin component, and it goes through the bucket service and then towards the log service. Now, when you look at this issue, you may think like admin component is trying to use log service, but it can't because it cannot find it for some weird reason. But the reality is different. The admin component and the log service, or the connection between the admin and the log service, is not the issue. And I'm going to show you why. The admin component uses the logs component here, and the logs component uses the log service. We already know that. But the admin component also uses a bucket component, which uses bucket service, and bucket service uses log component. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this app bucket, and I'm going to also remove the usages of bucket service. So I'm not changing anything with logs component. I'm targeting the bucket component. So I'm going to also comment out this as well. So if I remove the usage of the bucket component, not the logs component, let's see what happens. If I go to my app and refresh, you can now see we get a different error. We see environment injector log service. So it says it could not find log service in the environment injector up the hierarchy. And that is because when Angular tries to find something that is a dependency, it tries from the component or from the place where it is required. So let's say admin component is supposed to use the log service. So that means it's going to try to find it here on the admin component level. Then it's going to try to go to the parent, and eventually it would go to the root. That's how things work. So right now we can either provide the log service to log component directly, or we can go and provide it on the admin component level. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide it on the admin component level. So let's go to the admin component here, and in the providers array, we can go here and say logs service, right? Let's save this. Now, if I go to my application, you see that everything works, which means that we fixed an issue of admin trying to use the log component and the log component trying to use log service. So here you can see we have app root, we have app admin, and then we have the logs component, which shows the logs. And I'm using the Angular dev tools that you can also find in the description of this video, which is a really good tool to basically see how everything looks and if everything is working as intended. I'm going to go back to my code and I'm going to enable this again. So let's enable the bucket service and also this particular code as well. And I'm also going to go into the HTML to render the bucket component. If I save this, go to my app, I don't see anything. If I go to console, we have the first error that we saw, which means that admin component is using something that uses bucket service, and bucket service uses log service, so it can't find it. And we know that admin component uses the bucket component, which uses the bucket service and eventually log service. So what's the issue here? The issue here is actually this thing right here. The bucket component uses bucket service. So when the bucket component tries to resolve where is the bucket service, it starts from here, it goes to the admin component, then it goes to the app component, and finally it looks at the root. And in the root, it can find the bucket service. But the bucket service depends on log service. So the bucket service will not start looking at bucket component. It would start looking right away here in the root, because the sort of hierarchy of finding an injector or finding a dependency goes up. So if something is in the root, it cannot find that on a component level. It has to only go up from here. And that is an issue. Now, there are several solutions to this particular problem. We can use class aliases to override some functionality. We can provide things on the component level as well. But one of the most common practices is to actually take this out and put it on the component level. But that would mean that we would now have two instances of the bucket service just like this. And the question is, do we want that to happen? And this is also a place where we want to think if we should use a providedIn or not. Now, in my case, yes, it makes sense to have the bucket service on a component level, even if it creates two different instances. Now, what does that mean? Wouldn't it be the case that the bucket service would have two different arrays for employee component and admin component, and they both would be seeing at completely different buckets? Well, not really. And I'm going to tell you why. If I go to the bucket service, you will see that we have this bucket signal, but every action that we have in this bucket, at least for now, has to do with local storage. So every bucket loads the items from the local storage. Every bucket adds the item to the local storage and removes from the local storage, which means that even if I have 10 different instances of bucket service, at least per this code, it would not matter because they all are working with the local storage and all of them would share the same data. So in my case, I can actually provide this on the component level. So I'm going to actually remove this from here, and then I'm going to go and provide this on the admin component level. So I'm going to go to admin component here, and after the log service, I'm going to also provide the bucket service just like this. Let's save this. And now if I go to my application, boom, you can see that this works. And I can also add items to my bucket just like this. I'm going to remove the breakpoint. Now you can see I can add multiple items, and all of them should also go to the local storage. So if I go to application and if I go to local storage right here, you can see that we have this bucket right here, which is shown right here. Great. But what about employee? If I go to employee now, this doesn't work. Why? The same error. The employee component uses the log service and the log service is not there basically. So we need to go to our employee component as well. And here we're going to provide the logs service because we decided to provide the log service and the bucket service on a component level. So let's save this. And now if I go to employee, you can see that this also works well. So I can add items here as well. But here you can see we have some logs for the employee, right? If I go to admin, what would happen? Boom, no logs for the employee. If I remove something from the admin and if I go to employee, no logs here. But where are my employee logs from before? If you remember what I said, when the component destroys, all the instances of the services would also get destroyed. So in this particular case, when we go from admin page to employee page, the log service gets destroyed, which means the local array that the log service has is gone. Same for the bucket service, but since the bucket service data is in the local storage, well, it doesn't really matter. We can always get it back. So even though navigating from page to page resets the bucket service itself, it still can get the value from local storage. As I said, it works on my particular case, but in your particular case, you may need more work with this particular architecture to find a solution. And now we have solved this issue where the employee and admin have their own logs. So this makes much more sense. Now let's say we refresh after clearing the network. If I refresh now, you're going to see a bunch of files here. For example, the main.js, which essentially contains the information that's really important for the app to actually bootstrap and run. For example, what routes are there? What is the default route where it should go? Similarly, you would find references to other files containing. So this is not everything on the main.js, but we also have other chunks as well, which are loaded as well. But they all are loaded as soon as the application is loaded or when the user opens the application. So all of this would still be loaded. For example, this tries to get this from this chunk WRW. If we have a look at this, this has the auth service right here. So even though we have multiple bundles, they are still loaded when the app starts. But would these bundles already contain a bucket service? So if I do Control-Shift-F here, I can actually try to find bucket service, and let's see if this is able to find it. You can see that it doesn't find. It says search finish, no matches found, because on the auth page, there is no component that uses a bucket service. That's why it's not loaded. And if you go to the routes.ts file, you can see that the admin component right now is lazily loaded using the load component function right here on the route level. So that means that until I actually go to the admin component, I will not load bucket service JavaScript in my web application, which means that if I go actually there, now I would actually load bucket service. And if I try to find it, you're going to see that we have this chunk which has the bucket service. So if we click this, we can actually see the bucket service right here. And there you go. You can see the class bucket service right here. You can see all the functions that we have right here. So bucket service got loaded when we actually went to the admin page. Now, is there anything extra that is loaded on the employee page? So we already got the bucket service. We already got the routes and all. So if I click employee, you will still see one more bundle. And that is for the overridden stuff for the employees. For example, this has a different bucket service called employee bucket service, in which we set the limit of how many items they can add and vice versa. And that's pretty much it. So we are loading things on a component level or on a route level, and until you go to that route, the services related to those components will not be loaded. Now, was that the case when we were using providedIn as well? Or is it just because we have lazily loaded components which have provided services within the components? And by that, I mean, if I go back to my admin component here, you can see that we are providing the log service and bucket service on this component level, not in providedIn. This component is lazily loaded when you go to the page. So that means these are ultimately lazily loaded. But is that the case with providedIn as well? For that, I'm going to go to my terminal. I'm going to just stash all of this. So git stash. Now, this means that now we have shared logs back again. So if I, for example, add a new item here, you can see that this is also visible on admin and employee. So we are back to square one. But I wanted to show you if the provided in had the same effect as well. So if I log out here, refresh, and try to find bucket service, let's see what happened. In this case also, you will see that the bucket service is not loaded, or the JavaScript bundle for that is not loaded until you actually go to the page. So even if you have provided in on a service, until there's a component that actually requires the service as a dependency, the bundle for that is not going to be loaded. And that is super exciting. And Angular is basically doing all of that optimization behind the scenes. So I'm going to clear the network and let's try this out now. So I'm on auth page, and if I Control Shift F and try to find bucket service, you can see that it doesn't find it, which means that even with provided in, until there's a component that has a dependency on a service and it's loaded, or you go to the particular page, the service bundle JavaScript will not be loaded. And this is something Angular is handling behind the scenes as an optimization for us automatically. So if I go to the admin page now if I try to find bucket service, you can see that this is part of this particular chunk right here. And we have the bucket service as we can see right here. Great. And the same is going to be for employee as well. So even with provided in, if I go to employee, there's a new chunk that appears. And here you can see employee bucket service. Super cool. I'm going to go back and do git stash pop. So I have my changes back. And now that we understand what is the actual difference between provided in and providing in a component level, let's move to another problem. We already know that the services are lazily loaded if you use them in lazy components, but there can be further optimizations, or there might be cases where you actually need more optimization. I'm going to show you one case right now. And that is if I go to admin page and if I try to refresh, you're going to see that in the network call, we'll have a lot of files. Let me show it again from the scratch. So we are on auth. Now I'm going to clear this. If I go to admin, you'll see we load some chunks, but we also load this huge file of 574 kilobytes of D3.js. D3.js is a library that is used to generate graphs or visualizations. And in this particular component, we have this analyze fruits function. When I click it, I actually see a graph. So for example, let's add maybe 2 grapes, just like this. And if I click this, you can see this graph looking like this. Now, until I actually use this feature, should the JavaScript bundle be downloaded or not? Now, for performance reasons, we always say that we should only use JavaScript, or we only use or load the JavaScript that's absolutely necessary to save the user's data, especially for the cases where they might have poor internet or where don't have a good network connection. So in this particular situation, loading D3 doesn't really make sense. Now, why does this file get loaded in the first place? If I go to my admin component, you're going to see that down here, we are using a function called perform fruit analysis, which gets triggered when we click this analyze fruit buttons, as you saw. And this essentially uses the bucket service, but then also this analysis service as well. And it passes the current bucket to this analyze fruits function. If I go to this file, you will see that at the top, we have the D3 file automatically imported. So what happens is, as soon as the user goes to this admin component route or admin page, we can see that we are injecting the fruit analysis service. Since we are already injecting it, it goes to this file and loads it. And since this file is dependent on D3, it also loads D3.js as well. So that's why we don't want to automatically load this fruit analysis service when the user goes to this component. But with this usage, it's actually going to happen this way. So how can we change and load this in a lazily loaded manner? The way to do that is, first, never to import this directly in the providers. That's one thing. Second, we don't want to use this inject like this, because if we are, then we are essentially loading as a dependency. So we're going to remove this analysis service from here. And now we are going to lazily load it. Since this is an async function, the perform fruit analysis, I'm going to use a wait to actually first import the file using the ES6 import. So I'm going to do it like this. So I'm going to say const analysis service module. And here I can do await and import. And in here, I can give it the path of the service. So services / fruit analysis service. When we do this await, we essentially get the module back. And from the module, which you can see right here, we can extract out the service. So here we can say const analysis service equals, and here we can say analysis module dot, and here you can see the fruit analysis service. So this essentially is a class that we can use as an injection token. So what we can do here is that we can use the injector from Angular core to create an injector. And down here, we can use this injector to provide this as a token and get an instance of that class. So here I can do something like this .injector.get, and I can pass this whole thing as an injection token. So if you look at this get method, you can see here, we provide this token or this class as a token. So when we do this, we essentially get an instance of the fruit analysis service right here. So I can remove the this dot here and everything else works the same. With that said, we don't even need the fruit analysis service import here as well, because we are importing it right here down below. So now if we save this, things are going to change. So I'm going to show you it again from the scratch. So we go to our homepage, we load a bunch of stuff. Then if we go to admin, no D3. Hey, that's exactly what we wanted. So now if I click analyze fruits, then we are going to get the D3.js and also the chunk that includes the fruit analysis service. So we are able to lazily load a service when we actually want it, not to have this 574 kilobytes of D3 when the page loads. And that is a pattern that not only you can use with services, but other modules as well. So you can lazy load different modules and might even be do more going forward. And that's pretty much it. We looked at when to use providedIn and when to provide services on a component level using the providers array. We also looked at how to lazily load an Angular service in our Angular application. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more that you can do with lazy loading when it comes to Angular. And there are so many tricks that I need to learn, and maybe you can also learn as well. And if you really want to get ahead in your Angular career with concrete examples, I would highly encourage to get this Angular cookbook, which is a project-based book. It has more than 86 projects and has a lot of examples, including animations, unit testing, end-to-end testing, progressive web apps, dependency injection, and whatnot. This is super cool. With that said, let me know how you feel about this video and if there's something that you want me to create videos about. And as always, happy coding. I'm going to see you in the next one.